If we go back, if we cast our minds back to late 2015 when I came up with the idea for the book, David Cameron was still Prime Minister, so it seems a long time ago for one thing. But there was a great deal in the news at the time about how there were a record number of people in work, how the economy was well on the road to recovery after a long recession. There was a lot of supposedly good news kind of on the economic front. But if you looked behind the headline statistics, there was something a bit more disconcerting going on. So, for example, there was a huge rise since 2008 in zero-hour contracts. So no guaranteed hours each week. People working in much more precarious jobs than in the past. There was the appearance on the scene of something called the gig economy, which we hadn't really heard of years before, where people were working typically through mobile phone apps for their work. They were classed as self-employed. They weren't employed by a company, but they supposedly had freedom and autonomy to work when they wanted, and for this they typically didn't get some of the old workers' rights, so holiday pay, sick pay, a minimum wage, etc. And you weren't really hearing much of this from the government for a start, and also it seemed like a better way to kind of paint a journalistic picture of it would be to actually go out there and have the conversations with people who worked in those jobs, do the jobs myself, and kind of fully immerse myself in that as a project for a period of time to really kind of bring to life the sights, the sounds, and the experience of working in the new precarious economy, if you like. The other reason I did it was I come from a kind of working class / lower middle class family, and until I was 23 I did jobs which were very similar to those which I do in my book. So I worked in a yogurt factory, a toilet paper factory, I was a bus driver, a postman, did bar work, glass collecting, worked in a petrol station, did all kinds of low paid jobs. And I wanted to go back 10 years later, as it were, and see and kind of tell the stories that I wish I would have been able to tell when I was younger working in those jobs. I wanted to go back as a journalist, because until I was 23 when I did that work, I didn't have a book deal for a start. I didn't have access to newspaper columns, etc. I couldn't write about it in the same way that I can now. I didn't have any audience. So I wanted to go back and kind of use the things I'd learnt in journalism and apply that to just like my previous life in a way. And also some of my kind of favourite, growing up, some of my favourite journalists and writers had done similar things themselves. So most famously would be George Orwell in Down and Out in Paris and London. Jack London, prior to Orwell, went out into the East End of London and kind of lived as a tramp and reported on the things he saw. Henry Mayhew had been someone I'd read, had kind of investigated poverty in London. And then even more recently, Barbara Ehrenreich in the United States did a similar book. And Polly Toynbee did a book in, I think it was 2002, in which she looked at kind of low-paid jobs under New Labour, when New Labour was in power, and looked at kind of the experience of that. So it was kind of there's a long tradition of this kind of reporting, and I ripped that off basically, and no one had done a book like this for a while, so it seemed like a good time to do that. The first place, I mean, the book's become kind of known for what I did at Amazon, for what went on at Amazon, not what I did necessarily, but what went on in the Amazon warehouse in the town of Rugeley. I actually ended up at Amazon by accident though. It was at the beginning of 2016 when I was looking for jobs. I was kind of looking more geographical locations rather than a specific job. So I thought it was important to kind of get a broad spread of work around the country, so it wasn't an atypical example. So the job I did was fairly representative of something you could do in various parts of the country. But I noticed an agency called Transline was recruiting for jobs in the Amazon warehouse in a town called Rugeley. I'd never heard of this place either. And I was later to find out Transline was the agency which Sports Direct was using, so it should have been fairly ominous. But it was easy to get a job. I saw this job advertised with Amazon, put an application in. It was very, very straightforward. You just had to prove that you had a right to work in the UK and send a kind of very rudimentary CV. Then I received a phone call a few days later inviting me into Rugeley for Cannock Chase actually for a induction. And all you had to do at the induction again was pass a drug and alcohol test, which I'd never had to do that for a job before. Fairly fortunate in journalism, really. And then you were given the job. You had to fill out a bunch of forms, have your passport or driving license, and then you basically got the job in this Amazon warehouse. And I was given the job with around, I think it was around, it's just over 100 people in that intake. So then we were told that we would start a week later. And it was myself and probably about three other English people, I think, started. British people started, myself, and then the rest were predominantly migrants from Eastern Europe. Most of those were from Romania. So it was Romania, and for some reason it was almost all Romanian, not even specifically Eastern Europe, but mostly Romanians. And so we started working in this warehouse. We were doing 4 days a week, 10 and a half hours per shift, so each day. So you do 4 days, 10 and a half hours each day, and then you'd have 3 days off. And and I mean, I wrote on the first, I was worried when I started the book that it was mainly going to be boring, that the work was going to be boring. I didn't really know what was I going to write about. It would be an economic study of what it was like to manage on the minimum wage. It would be an economic study of the local community, so how the economy had changed over decades from industry to companies like Amazon. But then when I actually got inside the warehouse, I mean, on the very first day, the book began to write itself because of some of the things that were going on there. So I mean, we were told, the funniest thing, I guess, first of all, was we were told on the first day that we couldn't even call it a warehouse. We had to call it a fulfillment centre. And also, if we lost our job, we weren't fired or sacked, but we were released. That was the word you had to use. And you weren't a worker, and the people, your managers weren't your bosses, but you were all associates. So they said on the first day that Jeff Bezos is an associate, and so are you. We're all one big happy family here at Amazon. There were also kind of Orwellian-style cardboard cutouts around the warehouse with speech bubbles coming out of them saying things like, we love coming to work and we miss it when we're not here. Which, yeah, kind of like in North Korea, but with Jeff Bezos as the dear leader. So, I mean, that was the initial impression of Amazon from walking around the warehouse during the induction. It was, you know, slightly weird and cultish, but kind of harmless enough, perhaps. We were told kind of, you know, you're not allowed to wear hooded tops or sunglasses because we might need to see whether you've had anything to drink in the pub the night before. There were kind of, we were told that you can't run in the warehouse, which again, that seems relatively fine, because why would you run around the warehouse in the first place? But you'd lose your job. All the jobs were temporary, so we were going to lose our jobs after 9 months anyway. This was all of us. This was the biggest employer in the town. And we were also told there was this point system where if you kind of flout the company rules, you would receive a disciplinary point, and if you receive 6 of these points, you would lose your job. We soon found out it was really, really easy to accrue those disciplinary points. So if you took a day off sick, so I had a heavy cold, worse than I have now, one day, and I phoned in beforehand, 3 hours beforehand, offered to go to the NHS walk-in centre to get a doctor's note. They said, no, it's fine, you phoned in, you don't need that. But when I went in the next day for work, I received a disciplinary for it, for taking a day off sick. And they said, when I queried this, they said, this is Amazon's policy, this is what we've always done. Like being in school and being told, why do this? Because I told you so. There was no explanation. It was Amazon have always done this. Funnily enough, that's the thing they always deny having done when they're presented with books like mine in front of the TV cameras. People also receive disciplinaries for taking toilet breaks. So at the end of every shift, we'd receive a kind of dressing down. At the beginning or end of every shift, we'd receive a dressing down by our kind of team leader from the agency and from Amazon, who would admonish people for taking what they'd call idle time. So during work at Amazon, you had to carry around this handheld device at all times, and it tracked where you were in the warehouse, and it tracked how fast you were collecting people's orders. So my day as an Amazon worker consisted of holding this device. You'd kind of clock into it, and then it would tell you where in the warehouse based on these codes. So this huge warehouse, 4 floors, the size of 10 football pitches. Amazon would boast about the size of the warehouse, almost like phallic, like boasting. So it's the size of 10 football pitches, and there's signs everywhere saying it's the size of 10 football pitches. I don't know why. So this device would tell you where you need to go along the colour-coded aisles and which floor you'd have to go. So I was on the very top, the 4th floor, and there was only 2 toilets we had access to, which were on the bottom floor, and you had to go through airport-style security to get to the toilet. So every time you left the warehouse, every time you went on a break, whether a toilet break or your official break, you had to kind of take your belt off, just like in the airport. It was just like that. Take your watch off, belt off, show them the inside of your wallet, take your shoes off. I think we had to take our shoes off. And they checked you for like electronic devices and whatnot, or whether you'd stolen anything. So all of this takes 5-10 minutes to do that if you want to use the bathroom. And there was only 2 toilets we had access to in this huge warehouse, so people are kind of walking sometimes a quarter of a mile to reach the bathroom, having to go through this security, and then by the time they get back to the workstation and with their clock back on their handheld device, it's kind of 5 to 10 minutes if you've kind of been speedy about it. And whenever people were being given disciplinaries left, right and centre for taking this so-called idle time, which in practice was just using the toilet. So, I mean, I began to see then working at Amazon why there were so many people I started the job with, because there's this huge turnover of staff where people are joining the company, they're clocking up disciplinary points for taking days off sick, for taking too long in the bathroom, for swiping, say, a few minutes late for your shift, you get a disciplinary point then, and you only need 6 of these to lose your job. So if you take 6 days off sick, happens to everyone at some point, you have the flu or something, take a week off, then say you're off the following Monday, you immediately lost your job. And it sounds kind of, for me, it's easy for me, I suppose, to be, I try not to be, but it's easy for me to kind of be flippant about that. Oh, you lose your minimum wage job at Amazon, why does it matter? But it's the biggest employer in this town. So, yeah, you begin then to see that, then as I spent more time in the town, you meet a lot of angry people and resentful people who are kind of disillusioned with what's happened to the town over recent decades. So, I spent a lot of time in kind of the pubs and social clubs there, just having conversations with people while I was there, just to see what they kind of felt about towards Amazon, what their feelings towards the company were. And then I learnt more about the town's kind of industrial past. So, Amazon arrived in 2011, promising, I went back through some of the old local newspapers, and there was, one of the headlines is great excitement in Rugeley as Amazon pledges to create 2,000 jobs, I think it was. And much of the excitement was on the basis that was built on the fact that the Lee Hall Colliery was previously the biggest employer in town, a coal mine. It closed in 1991, and up to just under 2,000 people had lost their jobs, but in practice it's more than that, because there's all the support industries that go with it. So the town, like a lot of places in the north of England, in the Midlands, in South Wales, had kind of lost, had never really recovered from deindustrialisation. And there'd been a period of kind of 10, 20 years where older people, typically older men, had got by on incapacity benefit, had made do with kind of part-time jobs here and there. And then Amazon arrived with grants from the local authority, same as in South Wales with the Amazon warehouse in Swansea, received millions and millions of pounds for the funding of the warehouse, for special roads to be built for the lorries, on the basis that it was going to create all of these jobs and help revitalise this former mining community. But when I arrived, hardly any local people were doing any of the kind of the shop floor jobs, as it were. As I spoke to people, they had done those jobs when Amazon first arrived, but people had either lost their jobs based on the things that were happening when I was there, the disciplinary system, the short-term contracts, or they'd just been so disgusted with how they'd been treated that they hadn't put up with it. So, I mean, I hadn't worked in a job before where you hadn't been allowed to take a toilet break or take a day off sick, where you were punished for taking a day off sick, even with a letter from your doctor. I'd never done anything like that before. I'd never experienced anything like that before. I never really even heard of anything like that before, apart from maybe at Sports Direct, which was kind of interesting. But so you'd go around town and you'd speak to older people, and one comment, a guy called Alex, a former coal miner, said to me, he he said to people, oh, he sees younger people around the town who do work at Amazon, and they say, I only work at Amazon. And he said, I'd never say I'm only a collier, because that's what you were, and you had kind of pride in your work. And without kind of wishing to romanticise coal mining, because you could die underground and you're unlikely to die in an Amazon warehouse, there was kind of the complete lack of dignity and self-respect in some of these in jobs like an Amazon was made something like coal mining seem appealing in comparison. That's how bad it was, especially with some of the older jobs. You still had a trade union movement, for example, with the legal colliery. You had a strong trade union. You had the kind of institutional affiliations that went alongside those jobs. So when the industrial jobs disappeared, a culture was destroyed as well, in a way. That kind of like the old kind of social democratic socialist culture. You didn't really have that either. That support network which went alongside the older jobs. And funny enough, I mean, I may as well bring it up because it's kind of relevant to the debate in Westminster now. I mean, I spoke to around the town. Almost everyone said they were voting Leave in the European referendum, and at this point, I expected it to just be a Remain vote. I expected it to just be, the Scottish referendum had been kind of a status quo vote previously in 2014, and I expected the Brexit referendum to just be kind of, Remain just slightly to win. But then you went around the town of Rugeley, and similarly when I went to Blackpool later on, and you'd meet all of these people who would say, they didn't necessarily particularly have a great deal of animosity for the EU in particular, but it was just this resentment that the town had got worse over the last 40, 50 years. You'd see kind of buses of Romanian labourers being brought in on coaches even from Wolverhampton, Walsall and Birmingham, who were themselves being really badly exploited in this Amazon warehouse, but they were simply more desperate than local people for work because, you could earn at Amazon, 3 times maybe what you'd earn in a similar job in Romania. So they were doing it themselves out of a kind of desperation. And that was kind of played off against you as a worker at Amazon. So we were told by the agency one day that, if you don't want the job, if you don't want to put up with this, he said, I've got 70 Eastern Europeans who will take it in your place. So it was kind of, you were played off against each other. And there was this simmering kind of resentment in the sound. And I think that fed in partly to what we saw with the referendum vote. It was people wanted to kind of take back control in some way. Not to go on too much about Amazon. That's the first chapter of the book. From there, I went to Blackpool, where I worked as a social carer, like home care, domiciliary care, going from home to home and driving in my car, helping to care for elderly and disabled people in the town of Blackpool. And that was probably, in some ways, that was the hardest job I did personally, because the stakes were higher in that you were caring for a human being rather than just taking items off a shelf to deliver for someone. And you also had, it was minimum wage, 0-hour contract. And you also, you took your work home with you to a greater extent than you would in some of the other jobs. So it was physically exhausting. But then you also had to you had to be emotionally quite strong to deal with, some of the carers are sitting with someone as they pass away. You're dealing with people who are incapacitated in various ways. And it's just can be quite a harrowing experience. And you're not always providing them with sufficient care because you're up against the clock and because you're not really given the resources to give people sufficient care. So, for example, all of our care visits, so we'd have around 8 or 9 or 10 care visits scheduled per day, and each care visit's scheduled for 30 minutes. 30 minutes, but that includes your driving time to and from. So you've got to drive around the town of Blackpool. Includes your driving time to and from the houses. So realistically, you have about 20 minutes per visit. And during that time, you have to do everything from, you might go in and there's someone who's in their 90s, you get them out of bed. You wake them up, you get them out of bed because you let yourself in. Take them to the bathroom, take them to the toilet, help clean them up after, give them a wash if they need that. Put a kind of pad in place or put any cream if they have bed sores, that kind of thing. Prepare them a kind of light breakfast. Get them dressed, obviously, first before you do that. Settle them in where they're going to spend the rest of the day until your next visit at lunchtime. So that's sometimes back to bed, sometimes that's the lounge. Switch the TV on. Give them any medication they might need, because almost always they did need some kind of medication. And you had to do all of this within like within a 20-minute window, and you had to fill out a pile of forms as well to say that you'd given the medication, to say what time you visited, etc., etc. And within 20 minutes you were expected to do this, whereas in practice you couldn't. So what happened was, all the carers ended up working through all of their lunch breaks. So the conscientious carers, which was almost all of them, would work through their lunch breaks, would just not. So you'd work, say, you'd start about. I started at 7:30 in the morning, and then you would break for lunch about 1 or 2, and you supposedly have 2 hours then, and then you come back on at 4 or 5, and then work till 9 or 10 at night. But because you were running over each time with your shift, because it took longer than 20 minutes to do all the jobs, you'd have like 20 minutes for lunch or something. If you took the full 2 hours, you just wouldn't be doing the job properly, and 1 or 2 people might do that, but most of the carers would. They saw it as the carers I interviewed anyway saw it as a vocation. They realised they were doing something important and wanted to do the best. They took a great deal of satisfaction from leaving someone comfortable and kind of sorted and as one carer put it to me, and kind of clean and comfortable. But mistakes still kind of crept into the work because you were so rushed. So during my time as a carer, I saw several examples of the medicine sheets not being filled out. And then someone else, the next carer comes in and then sees that the medicine sheet's not filled out, so they give the person the medicine again, effectively like poisoning them. And this happened twice in one of the weeks I was there, and carers I spoke to said, yeah, it happens all the time. And then people end up having to go to A&E sometimes, and then, I talk about, obviously that costs the NHS, but the main thing's not about the cost, but it ends up costing the NHS more, purely because we don't fund the social care system properly. It actually costs us more in the long term. But that was, I suppose, the most shocking part of the book in a way. It's the most depressing. Blackpool is somewhere where you have a lot of people go there to retire. There's high incident of health problems as well, like MS. So you visit a lot of people with MS, and you see people who. You're the only person they see all day as well sometimes. So you go in the morning, you go in at lunchtime, then you go in the evening. And one of the things that, with care that can't be given a monetary value is the conversation. So the time you spend with someone, people will want to talk to you because they won't see anyone else all day. We hear a great deal in the news about kind of loneliness epidemic, etc. And so you go in somewhere and someone, say an elderly person, will want to have a chat with you. That would be part and parcel really of what they expected from a carer, which I think is fair enough. But you would have no time to do that, so you see the disappointment kind of etched on their faces as you rushed out of the house. The turnover in the care sector based on, it's very poorly paid. So your minimum wage, you actually paid less than the minimum wage because you're not paid for the driving time. This is another thing. So you're paid for 20-minute windows. You're not paid for the 10 minutes it takes to get from one property to the next, or for the petrol that you use getting there. So you're effectively paid for your time less than the minimum wage. So this means, and it's predominantly 0 hours contracts as well. So this means that there's predictably a huge turnover of staff in the care sector each year. So for the average job, it's 15% per year. There's like a turnover. In care sector, it's 25%. So you have. So there's a much higher rate of turnover each year, and that itself affects care as well. So you're doing kind of personal, intimate things with, you're going to see someone, you're taking to the toilet, etc. You're giving them a bath, and you don't really want a different person necessarily coming in every day to do that. So people would complain about that, and it's because the sector's unfunded, because people are paid low wages, poor contracts. It has a knock-on effect on the people who you're charged with looking after. So I remember one carer said to me, she said no disrespect to cleaners, but we're treated like glorified cleaners, and she said that this mattered because the level of kind of responsibility you have for people. I think she said the kind of end result of this was you have people who'd fought in the Second World War, fought in the Korean War, who basically treated like dirt. Because we don't fund the care system properly. And also 0 hours contracts. 0 hours contracts, I'd been on a 0 hours contract before I did the book. I'd been on several a few years ago, but one thing that hadn't really happened, I hadn't really thought of until I saw it in the care sector was 0 hours contracts were used also to discipline staff. So when staff did blow the whistle on things like medicine sheets not being filled out properly, when staff blew the whistle on things that were going on that shouldn't have been going on, when kind of if someone got sick of being sent on the worst job, for example, or just complained about something, or even as one carer put it to me, when a couple of them brought up the prospect of joining a trade union in their care branch, they weren't fired, because then the employer would be up before an employment tribunal. What happened was their hours were just suddenly cut down, so they were doing 35-hour weeks every week for months and months. That was what they kind of expected from work. And then they'd go in one day soon after making a complaint, and they'd find that they were only being given now 2 or 3 hours a week. And then you get driven. One of the carers who's interviewed in the book, she says, you get driven out of a company. That's how they drive you out, because if you're used to managing on a full week's wage, and then you're suddenly dropped down to just a few hours a week, you have to go elsewhere, because you can't live off that money. And in our contract, it stipulated for the company I worked for that you couldn't get another job on the side without the express permission of that company. So you had to effectively be on call the entire week, even if you were only working. So 2 weeks I didn't work at all, but I was expected to be on call the entire time, because that's the power. Kind of companies can use 0 hours contracts in that way, and the kind of I was really quite shocked. I expected it to some extent in the kind of manufacture, or in Amazon and warehouses, but to see that kind of the impact that had on where kind of human beings are parcelled up and sold to the lowest bidder in the care sector, if you like, was pretty shocking. From Blackpool, I went down to South Wales, where I lived in Swansea and Ebbw Vale for a period of time around towards the end of 2016. And you had many things in South Wales. It was similar to Rugeley in some ways, in that you had kind of, as I did kind of research in local places like Ebbw Vale, Cwm, Merthyr Tydfil, you had a lot of the problems still stemmed from deindustrialisation, or the way it was done anyway. At any rate, so you have in Blaenau Gwent, you had one in 6 people on antidepressants, which there'd been no history of that before the pits and the steelworks closed. And the jobs that had kind of replaced those old jobs had been things like there was an Amazon warehouse in Swansea as well, and call centres, lots and lots of call centres. So I worked in an Admiral call centre, which, I mean, in a way wasn't so bad. It certainly wasn't as bad as Amazon. You were allowed to go to the toilet at least, but it was minimum wage work. But funnily enough, most of the people I worked with seemed to have university degrees. So so like myself, so they'd gone away to university with this promise of, a degree's a degree wherever you go, and then they'd come back and find that they couldn't get a job with it, so they ended up having £20,000 worth of debt, but working in for the minimum wage in a car insurance call centre, which was kind of bleak in a way. It was that was quite depressing in a way. People who had so much ability had kind of resigned themselves to doing that. But it was also lots of people in the local community, younger people, were locked out of those kind of service sector jobs, because on the one hand there's this kind of tragic aspect to it, where people for decades in the South Wales coalfields, people have been able to leave school. You didn't really need a great deal of academic qualifications, and you could effectively walk into a job at the steelworks, in a local factory, down the pit. Again, dirty and dangerous jobs, but relatively well paid. Very often you had a strong trade union movement. And they kind of imparted onto their children, a bit less nowadays, but certainly people I'm 36 now, so people around my age, they'd imparted this idea that you didn't really need qualifications to kind of get a job. That kind of attitude still lingered a bit. It lingered in my family a bit, in the Southwest as well. Whereas the contemporary economy is very much the opposite. So even to work in a call centre, you're almost expected to have a degree nowadays. So there was an element of tragedy where I meet lots of younger people who'd kind of were really struggling to get jobs because they didn't have professional qualifications. They didn't have the kind of customer-facing, personal skills that you need to work in something like a call centre, even though it is a relatively poorly paid job. And from, just to kind of skip on, because I'm wary of the time, from there's quite a lot. I mean, in the section on South Wales, there's quite a lot about deindustrialisation and the effect it's kind of had on communities like that, which I felt it was important to look at that, because that's the context behind. That's the context behind the growth of the kind of precarious economy, the disappearance of the trade union movement relative to its strength in the past, the way in which companies like Amazon use the way in which the kind of company structure is set up that makes it very hard to get a trade union in these workplaces and sustain it. So none of the jobs I actually worked in there was a trade union, apart from, funnily enough, I got a job as an Uber taxi driver for the final chapter of the book, and that was, I guess, slightly more optimistic in that while I was writing the book, a couple of trade unions were actually taking on Uber for kind of their workers' rights to be paid the minimum wage, to be given holiday pay, sick pay, because Uber, I mean, Uber's business model, from what I gathered from working with them, so it was relatively easy to become an Uber driver. I had to borrow some money to pay for the license from Transport for London, and you had to take a basic kind of topographical map reading test, and then you have to go for an induction with Uber proper. You meet people from Uber once, where they just show you how to use the app, give you kind of a rundown of their rules and stuff, and that was the point at which kind of this illusion of it being self-employment, this illusion of freedom and autonomy, etc. Because they sell it to you on the basis that you earn £16 an hour. This is what I heard first of all. You earn £16 an hour. You're your own boss. You have freedom, flexibility, autonomy, etc. Blah blah blah. And it sounds pretty good. It sounds pretty good if you've been working in an Amazon warehouse for minimum wage, where in fact some people were paid less than minimum wage. So just to roll back to the Amazon parts, a young woman I interviewed at Amazon was paid 42 pence an hour by the employment agency, and it took 6 weeks to get the money back because Amazon didn't care. I was underpaid half the time I was working at Amazon, paid below the minimum wage, due to kind of administrative errors. I did get the money back, but it's at the time, when the landlord wants the rent and stuff, that's not particularly helpful. So Uber, I mean, compared to that, Uber sounded quite good. You did have freedom as far as you could turn the telephone app on to work when you wanted. So for those who aren't familiar with Uber, what it is you have your smartphone, you download the Uber app as a driver, and what it does is it connects you with a passenger who also has an Uber app, who instead of standing out in the street for 10 minutes like waiting for a traditional taxi, they request an Uber, and the nearest driver will receive a bleep on their phone, and so you're connected directly with them. There's no kind of middle person, like taxi cab office, facilitating it. So you get a beep on your phone driving around, and then theoretically, a passenger should be there. So you go and pick them up and take them. Then you find out as soon as you pick them up where they want to go. Right, it's fairly straightforward. And you were supposedly self-employed, so you could turn on the phone, you could work when you wanted, etc. And for this, you didn't receive a minimum wage. You received like a piece rate. You didn't get holiday pay or sick pay. You had to fund your own time off, etc. And you had to pay for your own expenses, so car maintenance, the car itself, license, all of this stuff. But we weren't really self-employed. This was what I soon found out at the induction. So we were told at the induction with Uber that you can't pick and choose what jobs you do for Uber. Those were the words they used. Whatever jobs Uber sends you, you're obliged to accept them. You can't even talk about certain subjects with the passenger in the back of your car. So you weren't allowed to talk about politics, religion, or sport. Which basically, like, you have nothing else to talk about as a cab driver. That's it. But you weren't allowed to talk about those things. So obviously, it feels straight away like they're Uber's passenger rather than your passenger. For those of you who've used Uber, you'll know that as a customer, you can leave a star rating. So between 1 and 5 stars for the quality of your journey, etc. If, as a driver, your rating fell below 4.7 stars, you'd be brought into the office for a dressing down and deactivated, as another euphemism. You'd be potentially deactivated with a temporary or a permanent ban put in place on you using the app. Which again, these things were all, it's a very strange form of self-employment. It felt very much like Uber was your boss. It was dictating what you could talk about, it was dictating what kind of jobs you could do. And it was threatening to, if your rating fell below a pretty high level, 4.7 is very high. You're potentially being banned from using the app and losing your job. And typically you've got a car on finance because it's a hybrid cars they want. So almost all the Uber drivers have these cars on kind of quite big finance deals. So if they lose their job, they're screwed. And for all of this, for this freedom and this flexibility and autonomy, we kind of sacrificed our right to workers' rights, our right to holiday pay, sick pay, and minimum wage. So you kind of get an idea of you soon got the idea that what was happening was Uber had simply offloaded risk, business risk, onto workers, so drivers, but also the taxpayer. So similarly, I interviewed kind of people working in the gig economy for companies like Deliveroo, similar kind of business model, where, so a guy I interviewed in the book, he worked as a courier for I think it was Deliveroo. Sorry, it's 3 years ago now, for Deliveroo, and he damaged ligaments in his arm on the bike one day, because it wasn't Deliveroo actually, it was another courier, but where you have to carry things like mattresses, big things on the back of this bike. And because he damaged ligaments in his arm, he couldn't work for 2 months, I think it was. Because he didn't receive sick pay like he might from a traditional company, at least some sick pay, he had to then sign on to housing benefit. So he had to fund his time off, and then the taxpayer funded his time off as well, because the company had essentially offloaded risk onto workers and onto the taxpayer. So just to kind of round up off that point, I guess. So Uber, when it was set up, its CEO, a guy called Travis Kalanick, he said that Uber wanted to make transportation as reliable as running water. And what that means is, if you turn the tap on, there's water comes out immediately. You don't have to wait for 10 minutes for the water to come out. It's there straight away. So in terms of transportation, what that means is you have to have a fleet of taxi drivers on the streets at all times. So like to create that network effect where there's always taxis kind of swarming around the city. And then from there, the question then is who pays for that? Who pays for that network effect? In a traditional business, in say a shop, the member of staff isn't only paid when someone enters the shop. So you're paid a kind of flat rate. So whether whether all of us are in the shop or whether there's no one in the shop, the person behind the till still gets a wage. What Uber's done is it's created this impression of the reason it's created this kind of impression that drivers are self-employed is so that when you have this fleet of drivers driving around London, say, or Bristol, at all hours of the day, burning their own petrol, using their own time, with no one in the back of the car, just creating this network effect for Uber, they're paying for it themselves. So they're paying for the fuel, as I said. They're using their own time, and Uber doesn't have to pay any of that. And Uber also doesn't have to pay for any of their downtime, such as annual leave, or if they get sick, or Uber only kind of pays for a valet if someone vomits in your car, which does happen sometimes, because the best time to work is the evenings when the clubs are throwing out. But yeah, so I mean, it was very clear what was. It was, as a driver, it was relatively straightforward that you weren't really self-employed, only insofar as you could turn the app off when you didn't want to work. Which that isn't nothing. But almost all the Uber drivers work the same hours anyway, because Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, through the night, and like commuter runs, that was when you made any money. The only people who were working kind of 2-3 in the afternoon were the people who did 100-odd hour weeks. So everyone kind of worked the same hours anyway. And that was the extent to which you were kind of had flexibility. And just to kind of finish off, because I'm running out of time, I guess the purpose of, the book obviously, to me, it changed my kind of consumer habits, as it were. I mean, in that, I stopped using Amazon. I still use Uber in emergencies, but then I tip the driver, because the bigger issue there is the money that the drivers are making. So we made minimum wage after expenses as an Uber driver, despite the promises of making £16 an hour. It was around £8 an hour in London, so it's less than the living wage. once you've taken out kind of car costs, all of this stuff, petrol costs, you were even encouraged by Uber to provide sweets and bottles of water for passengers out of your own pocket, in order to keep your rating at 5 stars. But it's, I mean, I guess the thing that really kind of struck me was, which a comment was made to me by the general secretary of one of the trade unions which was taken on at Uber. He said to me that, you know, we have to kind of nip some of this work in the bud, because it's spreading. Because it's not just kind of the person delivering your pizza, picking you up in the taxi, sorting your Amazon item, which it's not just that person's. It's not just the moral question of should someone be treated like that in the Amazon warehouse. I mean, I don't think they should. I think there is that strong moral case for that. But there's also a case of self-interest. So this stuff isn't going to stay confined to kind of the lowest paid jobs. It's spread to journalism, my profession. It's spread to academia, as anyone who works in that knows. People look at companies like Amazon, the biggest multinational in the world, and see Jeff Bezos as a figurehead, and then try to emulate that. And this is, you know, we have to nip this stuff in the bud because, as I said, yeah, it's spreading. And of course, there's also the moral case for should people who stay in their towns, who stay living in their towns like Rugeley, who don't go to university, are they as deserving and entitled to a life of kind of dignity and self-respect as someone who has academic qualifications? They're no less. Seems rather a kind of trite point to make, but they're no less of a kind of human being who's deserving of self-respect than someone who has, you know, 5 PhDs or something. It's simply because you work in that kind of working class manual job. You deserve to be treated as a human being, and you certainly do not deserve to be punished for doing things like taking toilet breaks by a company that can well afford to treat people with more respect.